If you've got a Yamaha MT-07 or older FZ-07 and you want to remove your factory rear passenger pegs to ditch some weight and make for a cleaner tail section appearance, one of the things you'll need to do is relocate that rear brake reservoir that's hanging out on the right passenger peg. And Vagabond Motorsports makes a kit to specifically move that rear brake reservoir in a very easy and robust manner up to the front shock mount on a special bracket. In this video I'm going to go through the install steps for the installation of that reservoir relocation kit. And I'll quickly review what's included in the Vagabond Motorsports reservoir relocation kit for the MT-07 and FZ-07. The primary component is a CNC laser cut and CNC formed piece of stainless steel sheet stock. It's going to be coated in a UV resistant satin black powder coat, so it's going to be very durable. It's going to match the factory finishes extremely well. It's going to have folded out flanges for the reservoir, so the reservoir can't rotate and the top can't essentially vibrate off, much like the factory bracket. It's going to have another flange with a rubber bumper so that it kind of keys up against the cases and doesn't vibrate over the life of your motorcycle. It's going to include a full hardware kit, including stainless steel washer, stainless steel bolt, and aluminum spacer. Everything here is proudly made in the USA. Some of the other details of this kit are that it is totally reversible, so that if you want to remove your factory passenger pegs for track days and things like that, and eventually put everything back to stock, this is totally reversible, doesn't modify any of the factory components in any way. The second big key detail is that there's no brake bleeding, no cutting of brake lines, no essentially dealing with brake fluid at all. And so it should be a very easy install process, and one that if you ever want to take it totally back to stock, you can without permanent modification. As for tools you'll need for the installation, if you're going to remove your factory passenger pegs, you will need the 6mm Allen key. If you just want to move the brake reservoir for whatever reason, you don't need that. You'll also need, for the install of this kit, a 4mm Allen key. It's useful to have a small flathead screwdriver to pop open the clips that hold the brake line, 8mm socket, and then the last thing you'll need is two 14mm sockets or wrenches. You can either use an open end wrench or a box end wrench on one side and a socket on the other. For this install, and I think the easiest way to loosen that bolt on your front shock mount is going to be with a socket on one side and an actual impact on the impact wrench on the other, just because it's kind of hard to get in there. But we'll go over that install in a bit. The first step of the install is going to be to remove your reservoir and then remove your factory passenger peg. So you're going to start with your 8mm socket, and you're going to pull off and you don't need to reuse this, but you should set it aside and store it just in case you want to go back to stock. And that's going to include that bracket that you can tell kind of has these same top and bottom flanges, kind of like the Vagabond bracket, and that nut, at which point the reservoir should be loose except for some keeper clips that we're going to take off in a bit. Now once the reservoir is loose, you can go ahead and actually remove those two big 6mm Allen head bolts that hold on your passenger pegs. And I would set those aside for reuse in the future, just if you ever want to put them back on. Now you can go ahead and take the opposite side, the shifter side passenger peg off as well, using the same 6mm head bolt. You can tell the only thing really holding the reservoir in any sort of position right now is this plastic clip. And you have to spread two little jaws of it open, and it may be useful to have a really small flathead screwdriver, but you should be able to get it out without it. One thing you'll notice here is this clip is going to be kind of useless at this point, and you can remove it and keep it aside with all your other factory parts. It just has a little barbed tip on it that goes through a hole, so you can kind of squeeze the top and pull it out, set it aside, keep it, because you're not going to be able to use it in this install. So like I mentioned, you kind of have your options depending on what kind of tools you have. My recommendation would be to throw one of your sockets, obviously in loosening mode, I suppose, on the bolt head side, and then use a long extension with a impact wrench. And you just have to be a little careful not to really grind on your clutch arm here, but you can come off it a little bit at an angle. And with the impact, you should be able to pull that nut off fairly easily. Now to prep your reservoir for mounting up front, it's kind of convenient how this works, but all you have to do is twist this whole unit, and I'd start kind of far back so you can kind of point the reservoir. The top should be on, so it's not going to be leaking fluid anywhere. But you're going to have to kind of thread it through your ABS lines. But you shouldn't really have to push too hard to get it to come out to the front side, essentially. And one of the things you'll want to make sure is that it should be a very nice clean run. You shouldn't be like tied up against the shock or anything else that's going to pinch as essentially the suspension cycles up and down. Once you get it to essentially this kind of front pocket, then we'll install it onto the bracket before we put the bracket onto the motorcycle. And once you've got your reservoir through into this kind of triangular pocket, we're going to mount it onto the bracket. And first step is going to be to take the small washer, thread it onto the long fastener we supply you, slide it through the aluminum bushing on that reservoir. Then take the aluminum spacer we provide and slide it onto the bolt. The last step is going to be to essentially, you can start it by hand. You're going to need the 4mm Allen wrench in a second, but this is going to rigidly, I guess rigid is a relative term because it's going to be on a bushing, but you can tighten this bolt to full tightness, essentially. Like, you don't have to worry about squishing the bushing. It's got metal to metal to metal contact. So use the 4mm Allen key to really tighten that up, because there's no reason for that to come loose. You're still bushing mounted, but you see we've got flanges here that are going to prevent this from moving, and it's certainly going to prevent this top from opening when it's in the bracket. At this point, we're ready to install the bracket onto the motorcycle. Now, every MT-07 FZ-07 is going to be a little bit different here, but one thing to look at is on the engine case, there may be, I'm going to use the 4mm wrench to poke at it, there may be a casting ridge here, and that may just kind of dig into this bracket a bit. If you tighten it down, it's not going to be a big problem, but we're supplying an extra N10 washer with this kit, and in this bike you can see there's a pretty pronounced little ridge. I always like using the washer in those cases so it doesn't essentially dig into the bracket. But once you just slip that washer on, there's still plenty of thread engagement in the locking nut, the factory locking nut. You kind of slide the bracket over. You'll see how it is supposed to mount, and really the only last thing is there's that rubber bumper, and you just want that to be more or less touching the engine case. Once you've got the bracket kind of loosely in place, you can see it should rotate down a bit, or up and down on that bracket. But you're going to want that rubber bumper to at least be kind of compressed against the case, just because it'll make it snug. It's not going to be really easy to do that until you get, so I just put that flange nut onto the shock mount, and we can tighten that by hand. I'm going to give it a little shot with the impact just to tighten it up. But you're going to want, at this point, hopefully you can see that there is, a little bit of up and down play on that mount, and we're going to want to push it down when we're tightening so that that rubber bumper on the bracket is actually engaged or just resting against the engine case. And that's just going to help keep things from vibrating over time. And so what I'd recommend is, if you can use a impact like this, just push gently down with one hand and tighten up that bolt. And one thing that we'll do is set the torque on this one, but again, with 2 wrenches you're going to want to set the final torque to the factory spec, which is, I believe, 32 foot-pounds. And so we'll set that. At this point the install is good to go. So once you've got that front shock mount bolted up and torqued to spec, I'll give you a quick kind of sweep view of the installed product, where you can see the factory bends in the brake line, or the hose running from reservoir to a master cylinder, do a very good job of kind of keeping them away from the shock and kind of tucked up against the ABS lines, brake lines. So it's a very clean install. That reservoir gets nicely tucked into that little space above the engine cases and out of the way, so that you have like a really nice clean tail section. Give you a quick view from a little further away so you can see the nice improvement to the cleanliness of the tail section with that kit installed on your FZ-07 or MT-07. Our parts can be found direct on our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com, also on Amazon for your Prime members, and eBay. Thank you very much for watching.